they have done studies with identical twins who have identical DNA. And one in the research, they were looking at twins that had been adopted, and that they found that two kids, identical DNA, one gets adopted by a family with addiction, one gets adopted with a family that does not have addiction, and assuming that they have a genetic predisposition because of the family that they were being adopted from, the kid who grows up in the family with addiction, those genes activate and they tend to become addicted. And the kids who grow up in a family that does not have addiction, those genes do not activate and they tend not to become addicted.
Howdy, everyone. It's your host, Polly Siegel. And for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm a licensed clinical social worker, certified addiction specialist, and master level trained mindfulness practitioner. I own a counseling practice in both Colorado and Illinois, and I specialize in trauma, OCD, and anxiety. If you live in either of those two states, feel free to reach out to me for a consultation and we can begin the therapeutic journey together. Now on to the good shit. Welcome to season 3 of Shit Talkin' Shrinks. Gosh, I'm so excited. I will be featuring experts in the healing space, and we're discussing a variety of mental health topics, the human experience, and society at large, while creating levity along the way. Get ready to laugh, learn a lot, and change your life for good. Hello, everyone, for another fabulous episode of Shit Talking Shrinks. I have a very amazing guest today. And in fact, you and I have we've heard of each other for a decade, but never actually met. And we're friends with everyone, and somehow our paths didn't cross. So I am very lucky to finally get to have an amazing chat. But let me do a formal introduction before we get into our topic. So I have Dr. Michael Barnes with me today. And there's a laundry list of accomplishments. So stay tuned. Here we go. Ph.D. in marriage and family therapy, licensed professional counselor, licensed addiction counselor, and the director of the Michael Barnes Family Institute, which works with folks struggling with trauma and addiction. So you're just an impressive dude. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, that's just because I'm old. These things happen and all these advanced ages. So.
Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about epigenetics, which I think is not a well-known topic, although is incredibly I just find it to be so wild. So before we discuss the different parts of it, what is epigenetics?
Well, by definition, epigenetics is how the environment impacts the function of our genes. It doesn't change, for folks to understand. Genes are in a double helix, which means they look like an old style phone cord that I had on my phone when I was growing up, and that there are proteins on it that attract each other, that turn genes on so that our eyes turn whatever color they're supposed to be, or whatever other genetic factor is that gene works on, or they repel each other and they turn the gene off so that whatever it is supposed to be controlling or activating is no longer happening. And so we used to think everything was genetic, meaning it was caused by genetics. And what we're finding now is that the environment that we live in, the environment that we grew up in, actually impacts whether the genes actually do what they're supposed to do or not.
So is it, and I'm naive on this topic, so let me just name that. But so we're all born with a set of genes that come from biological parents. And then those genes have the ability, certain genes have the ability to turn on based on environmental stimuli or stressors, or turn off based on environmental stimuli or stressors.
Yes, and there's an extra piece to this, and that is that certain environmental conditions cause other proteins to attach to the DNA, and that those they're called methyl proteins, and that they are kind of sticky and that they kind of bind the DNA either on or off based on whatever is happening with the DNA at the time. And that those methyl proteins can be passed through 3 generations of family members. So my grandmother might have had trauma causing the methylation of her DNA associated with her anxiety management system, and that she would pass that on to my mother, who, if she never got therapy or never managed her anxiety, which mine never did, can pass it then on to us.
Wow. So if we go with that line of thinking, let's start with grandparents. So if they endure trauma or they live in an environment with a lot of adversity, their genes are going to mutate and change based on that. And then that gets passed on to their offspring. And then that impacts the next generation, which then passes it on to the next generation.
Yes. I mean, those are all possibilities. And so I was doing a presentation this several years ago, and there's a guy in the front row who was asking me all these really good questions, and I thought, man, he knows something I don't know, because he's clearly leading me to somewhere. And so afterwards, I said to him, "What do you do? Like, you really know this stuff?" And he said that he worked in a medical school. He was a computational biologist. And I said, "Well, what do you study?" He said, "Epigenetics." Well, I'd asked him, "How did I do in my presentation?" He said, "You were good." He said, "You were a little obsolete. You missed some really important things." And I said, "What am I missing?" And he said, "Epigenetics," which is what he studied. And he said that is the future of a lot of medicine. And it's not just anxiety. It's all kinds of different illnesses that they're really beginning to look at, that the environment that we live in, either being highly stressful or having toxicity or having, chemicals, there's a lot of things where that environment can begin to impact whether the genes do what they're supposed to do or not.
So the genes could be, just general physical, medical issues, mental health issues. What else can be passed on?
Cancer is a big one that they're kind of thinking of, that, there are predispositions for certain kinds of cancers genetically, and that, everyone wonders, well, why did I not get it? Or why did I get it? And they're beginning to look at the environment that we live in as playing a role in some of that. And in our world, like things like addiction, for years, when they did the Human Genome Project, I was like very excited. I was thinking, okay, finally we're going to know what genes come into play for addiction. And they didn't tell us that. They said that there are certain genes that seem to play a role in that. And now we're beginning to recognize, oh, wow, the environment is what actually causes those genes to turn on or turn off. And they have done studies with identical twins who have identical DNA. And one in the research, they were looking at twins that had been adopted, and that they found that two kids, identical DNA, one gets adopted by a family with addiction, one gets adopted with a family that does not have addiction, and assuming that they have a genetic predisposition because of the family that they were being adopted from, the kid who grows up in the family with addiction, those genes activate and they tend to become addicted. And the kids who grow up in a family that does not have addiction, those genes do not activate and they tend not to become addicted. And so, and it's so interesting. Like, I think about my family, and my brother is 10 years older than I am. And people will say, well, you were raised in the same family. Well, were we? I don't think we were. I think my parents were in a very different place when I came along. They were tired from all of the things that have been happening. And so this idea of, well, if there's genetic predisposition, why doesn't everyone in the family develop it? Well, because the family isn't the same family at different stages of the life cycle of a family. And so some folks may be following a big crisis in the family where there's a lot of stress, and that wasn't present in the prior generations. So this idea of environment it's actually more complicated than people kind of think, but it's also much more influential than people think.
So, through your research and your understanding of it, what percentage of it is just purely hereditary versus environmental in terms of its ability to turn on or off a particular gene?
It's more epigenetic as to whether the gene is turned on or off. It's the environment. And so that actually activates the gene. And so the gene is, it's the same for everyone in that, particularly those identical kids. But how much stress there is in the family, how much conflict there is in the family, or how much conflict was in the prior generation of the family. And so often I'll ask a client, well, do you have a history of trauma, or was there a history of addiction in your family? And they'll say, no, my parents were both non-drinkers. And I'll say, how about your grandparents? Oh yeah, my dad's dad was an alcoholic. Is that one of the reasons your parents are non-drinkers? Yeah, because their family was so conflicted and there was so much trouble with my grandfather's addiction. Well, just because dad doesn't drink alcoholically, let's say, because his dad did, there's still the genetic predisposition being passed from generation to generation. And if there was that methylated protein, it could have been passed from grandfather to son, that, whatever, maybe the son has a trauma now that creates an environmental stressor for him. We kind of look now at like who becomes addicted. And there tend to be, in my mind, and this is the work of Paul Early, who's a fellow in the American Society of Addiction Medicine, says there's really 3 reasons that someone becomes addicted. And the first is genetic or epigenetic, if that predisposition is there. The second is self-medication. A trauma happens and that they find that, drinking alcohol or smoking weed or some other kind of substance reduces the stress for them. And then the third one is living in an environment where it's just so prevalent. And so I think 2 of those are really epigenetic, or have significant, well, I think all 3 of them have pretty significant epigenetic influence. That growing up in a family where there's a lot of addiction would generally mean that there's trauma involved in all 3 of those as well. And so someone asked me the other day, well, do you treat trauma or do you treat addiction? And I said, how do you tell the difference? They're almost always co-occurring. And for the families, it's the same thing. And I think that's something families don't understand, is all of this stuff we're talking about is influencing them as well as it's influencing their loved one. And a lot of times when I ask a family, so was there addiction in your family of origin? Or if I asked parents or a partner, and oftentimes they get offended. And it's like, well, what are you trying to say? That it's our fault? I said, no, I'm trying to say, well, what if this is a lot more complicated than you think? That it's just not a simple linear, because, my grandfather and because my dad had addiction, that it is environmental as well as it is genetic.
Well, it sounds like what you're saying is it's even maybe more environmental than we realize. And that, we kind of think of genes as fixed, or what you get is what you get. And, tough titties, like, I just got bad genes, but really looking at the environment and how much that plays a role. As you were talking, what was coming up for me is, being raised in a Jewish family, and obviously my family does not have any Holocaust. None of my family endured the Holocaust. But obviously growing up in the Jewish community, many friends of mine have grandparents that were Holocaust survivors. And I had the honor of really being able to grow up around them and experience them, which they're just the most resilient people on the planet through my eyes. But what was so interesting is when you talk to the children of Holocaust survivors, they really describe how much the anxiety and the hypervigilance and some of the more PTSD type symptoms they experienced in their house, even though the Holocaust was over, and how that then passed on to my generation, which were my friends. And the running joke is, Jews are very neurotic. Like we're just an anxious bunch of people. And then, IBS and all the stomach issues that come with us. But I'm thinking of this through the lens that we're talking about is like how much of our anxiety as a people, again, the Jewish people, is just epigenetics doing its thing.
I think it's a huge component. And I think that the majority of research, so there are three groups that have been researched pretty significantly for transgenerational trauma. One is Holocaust surviving families. One is Native American culture and Native American families. And the other is Black families that have slave history. But for every one of those groups, it's not just the transgenerational trauma. It's the cultural trauma, the historical trauma. There are just so many other traumas of living in a society that has not necessarily been the most supportive of those groups. And there was an interesting study in New York City of two groups of Jewish teenagers. One had great-grandparents who were survivors of the Holocaust, and the other group did not. And that there was a very clear difference in how the two groups managed anxiety. Both had a level of anxiety, but the kids that grew up in a family that had a lineage of Holocaust survivorship actually processed anxiety as if they had been traumatized, where the other population certainly had anxiety that would be consistent with sort of the cultural issues, but not anywhere near the same history. And some of the research with Holocaust survivor families looks at how many of the great-grandparents were in the Holocaust, and meaning that if you have a couple where both had experience, that there was significantly more family struggle with anxiety and hypervigilance and control than if only one. And then the other is how many generations is they. I was reading something not too long ago that said they really believe that after 3 generations, it sort of disappears. Those methyl proteins don't pass on. But for those 3 generations, it's pretty clearly a high possibility. So it would make sense. Everything you just, I just trying to support what you had just said as being, yeah, that would make great sense.
Well, and it was so observable. I mean, it was so observable in the Jewish community of children or grandchildren that came from Holocaust survivors, or any sort of persecution that was fled. It just, yeah, I mean, this is just living proof of what you're saying and the science behind it. And as you mentioned, Black communities that are marginalized, 400 years of slavery. I mean, how many generations is that of genes being mutated by severe trauma and maltreatment and everything? It's like, we can point the finger and label people so easily, but a lot of this is out of someone's control, it feels.
Well, I think, yeah, it's absolutely out of our control. I mean, we can't choose who our parents are, and we can't choose the biology of those things. And I think that's the other thing that I would really urge listeners to really consider, how biological it is. That it's, so often families really struggle with behavior and someone's dysregulation and how upset they get so fast, and as if somehow it's intentional, and it's not intentional. It's a hijacking of the part of the brain that tells us that we're safe or not. And I think the biggest myth that people with trauma have is that if I feel unsafe, I am unsafe, when that's not true at all. That they feel unsafe in many social situations or challenging situations, and that it's fully an autonomic nervous system response, that there's no volition to it. It's not intentional. But that's a same thing with addiction. I was just writing an introduction to a project I'm working on yesterday, where I was writing about that if you can understand that addiction is a chronic disease with biological components, just like the new term for trauma that the military has been using is post-traumatic stress injury, as opposed to post-traumatic stress disorder, because of the changes to the actual function, the form and function of the limbic system of the brain, and different sizes of very important parts of our brain. Everything in the brain tends to get smaller with trauma, except the one thing that creates the desire to check to see if we're safe or not, which is the amygdala, and it gets larger. And so that's why there's so much hypervigilance and control, even for family members, not just the I tell the story of our son, who is 37 now, was hit by a car when he was 5, and should not have lived. He was so injured, he was not supposed to live the night. But the idea of our, as parents' anxiety was every bit as bad as his. And my wife, his mom, witnessed the event. I didn't. And so we all had very different views of it, very different experiences of the trauma. But to understand that we as parents were actually, at one point I said to my wife, he's the healthiest person in this house. And he's the one that got hit by the car. That we need to start paying attention to our own autonomic nervous systems, because we're arguing, we're disagreeing, we're struggling, we're trying to control each other, and we're trying to control him. And there's that whole process of learned helplessness when a kid gets traumatized, that families try to bubble wrap them so that nothing bad ever happens again, which basically stops the kid from going through all the developmental stages that they need to go through. So it really is systemic.
I want to take a quick pause to talk about our sponsor, a company called BetterHelp. It's an online therapy platform where all the therapists are licensed and accredited professionals. It's affordable, you pay a low flat fee for therapy with your therapist, and it's convenient. Do it at your own time and at your own pace, and you can communicate with your therapist as much as you want and whenever you feel is needed. And more importantly, it's effective. Thousands of people have benefited from therapy using BetterHelp, and we're really grateful to offer all of our listeners 10% off your first month. So if you're interested in receiving therapy ASAP, click the link in our show notes and you can get started. And you get to save money.
The burning question I have is, so, I'm thinking about my best friend right now who will be giving birth next week. And Mazal Tov to her. So excited. And I think about, as she's pregnant, right, depending on her levels of stress, which I'm not here to comment on that at all. I have no idea what it's been like for her to be pregnant. However, I'm wondering, when you're pregnant, depending on how stressful your environment is, I would imagine you're turning on certain genes prior to the baby even being born. And then the baby enters the world, interacts with the world with these genes, potentially trauma genes, that are now influencing how the infant perceives themselves, others in the world. So my question is if you change your environment and you make the environment safer, you make the environment more secure, more stable, can you turn off a gene that had been turned on previously by changing your environment?
Yes, I believe you can. And there is research on exactly what you just said, that what is happening in utero when mom and dad are we think about the mom who knows she's going to give her child up for adoption, as soon as it's born, and what kind of stressors and what kind of anxiety, and what is that turning on and turning off for that infant as it's growing. And there's a book called It Didn't Start With You, and it's written by a guy whose last name is Wallen. And he said, when your grandmother was 6 weeks pregnant with your mother, that your mother's fetus already had all of the eggs that she would ever have to give birth to her children at, I think, 6 weeks of life, or of the life of the fetus. And so your DNA was being influenced in utero of your mother in utero. And so, like, that just blew my mind to think it's not just the environment that we're in. It's the environment. And I grew up in Pennsylvania, and steel mills and coal mines and railroads and all of those things. And there were so many accidents and so many things that, there was a lot of trauma in those communities, and how, just it got passed from one generation to another. One of the I do believe that if on some level, if moms can do a lot of mindfulness, a lot of meditation, a lot of exercise to keep the autonomic nervous system calm, that it can influence the development of some of that genetic on and off process. But the guy that I met when I was doing the presentation, I asked him about, how do you fix epigenetics? Like, there's got to be a way. I mean, if they're proteins, we should be able to figure out how to get rid of them. And he said, it's much more complicated than you think. And he said, it's really about changing the environment. And so he said the one thing that they have found that seems to work is mindfulness meditation. And that, so that would be the first thing I would suggest to any mom, is to get really good at keeping that nervous system as calm as possible, and be as active as you can be. And, take stock of the environment that they're in, because that's the same environment the child is in. And so, and it is what it is.
Sure. But let's go along with that timeline. So the baby's born, let's say the first few years the baby was in a stressful environment due to some sort of circumstance. I'm making this up here. But then let's say and maybe certain genes are turn on because of that. If that child, let's say 15 years old, gets into therapy, and they start to really work on themselves, and they're practicing nervous system regulation tools and coping skills, and they radically change the way that they're operating internally and as well as externally, will that change the gene so that then when they have children, it might not be passed on in the same way with the same protein buildup?
Yes, that's the theory, and that there are rat studies that have shown that if you have, rat mothers that nurture lick their babies, rat mothers that don't nurture don't lick their babies, they ignore their babies. And if you have babies that are infused into this mothering process, and the rat baby has those proteins, if the rat mom licks the baby, those proteins go away. If the mom does not, then the proteins do not go away. And the next generation that baby rat has their children, they will have those proteins. And so in looking at rats, we would assume that, yes, if that nurturance, finding a really supportive therapist that has unconditional positive regard, and who is helpful in that they challenge, but they do it in a way that is really trauma informed and trauma integrated, and that pendulating between the anxiety and the calming, that we have to assume if mindfulness meditation can help do that, that the therapeutic process can also help do that. And so That's why I think this trauma integrated care is the most important thing that any therapist can learn, is how to keep that room as safe as possible. The first study that was ever done on live children was in 2014. And what they found was that when they studied kids who had had really difficult early life circumstances, that had experienced abuse or neglect, that when they studied them as teenagers, they had the proteins. And what they found was that when the genes kind of were either activated or deactivated, I can't remember which happened, that the receptor sites for cortisol had been destroyed, meaning they had no way of turning off the fight-flight system. And so they were always anxious, and they were always dysregulated. And so, over time you can get those back, and you can, be healthy. But I remember as a young therapist, 40 years ago, we called them just difficult children. That they come out of the womb crying and what's the word? Consolable. That they're just always upset. And how much of that is absolute epigenetic function? How much of reactive attachment is epigenetics?
Yeah. Yeah. It's so fascinating you said that, because I just had a client, I swear, yesterday say to me, I have one kid, he's easy breezy, just a ball of sunshine, always has been. And then my other child was difficult for the moment, she entered the world. And he made a joke, like she had a scowl on her face the minute she was born. And, there's all these issues now. And so it's exactly what you're saying.
I have a couple different stories, but one is like, if you think about, we had this huge influx of young babies being adopted out of like Russia and different places around the world. And I was talking with someone who adopted a couple kids from an orphanage in Russia, and how when they went to pick the kids up, that there were 30 babies in a crib, and that they hadn't been picked up other than to be changed. And that, that's every therapist who works with reactive attachment has worked with at least one of those kids from one of those adoption agencies, because that's what they present with. And so you have to assume that this epigenetics is playing a part in it. So, I think it's a bigger deal than we have thought.
Oh, absolutely. This conversation illuminates that. As we segue into the last section of every episode is tangible tools. And so I think, the beauty here is that we do have the power to change our environment. We do have the power to work on ourselves, do deeper inner healing journeys, to learn adaptive coping skills, to regulate our nervous system. Like, we have that power. And so we're not helpless just because something was passed on to us, which to me is very empowering. So if someone wanted to begin to work on changing their genetics, right? Maybe they haven't had children, or they plan to, or they just want the rest of their life to look differently. Like, where would you invite them to start to, use different skills that act on the genes?
I would have them start with themselves as the parents. And the idea of, I say to staff on a regular basis, tell me again why we're upset with a traumatized client who's acting like a traumatized client. The idea of, so often in the field, we get these clients who are acting out and causing problems in the milieu, and staff want them to behave. And that idea of, if we can, we know who we're dealing with. And so if we think about attachment happens when children are dysregulated, hungry, they need to be changed, they're bored, they need some love. And then the big people in their lives come in and help them regulate their nervous system by watching their parents regulate their nervous system. And from a purely biological standpoint, that's what attachment is. I think we can do that now. And the idea of, if I have a child that is that really hard to console and is always upset and frustrated easily, is to be really clear that we're going to demonstrate what it looks like to regulate our nervous system. And as we're supporting them in this completely dysregulated state, rather than getting upset and getting frustrated that this needs to go away. But the idea of, well, being present with them, talking to them, allowing that bit of an outburst, but to also, in therapy, we talk to therapists about maintaining a non-anxious presence. And we can't worry about our anxiety and the kids' anxiety at the same time. So that idea of really learning how to manage our own nervous system, how to be present. There are so many good techniques these days for teaching people to regulate their nervous system. Resourcing skills from EMDR to somatic experiencing. There are all kinds of things. There are books on it for parents. And there's a good book called Raising Trauma Resilient Kids that was written by Peter Levine was like a second author on it, but it was a somatic experiencing group that really kind of talked about how do we help people who have kids with a dysregulated nervous system learn to become regulated. And so I would look for those kinds of books and those kinds of processes. I think family therapy with a really trauma-informed, trauma-integrated family therapist who's going to really understand the parents' trauma of having a child who they're so worried about. Like, what happens if this doesn't change? What's going to happen, when they get to school? What's going to happen in later years? And so a family therapist who understands everything from PTSD to developmental trauma to epigenetics to I'm actually teaching a class at CU right now on exactly this, a family therapy class to teach family therapists. Here's who's coming in the door, and here are the skills you have to help them. And these are all the presenting problems. So.
Mm-hmm. And then I think for the individual, because, there's plenty of people now, especially with the millennial generation, that don't want children because they don't want to raise little ones in such an environment in a world that's dark often, is the mindfulness piece is like really learning. And I love polyvagal theory for this, is learning skills to get your nervous system back into its window of tolerance, into a space of safety. So, I love that we talked about parents and what they can be doing for their children, family therapy as the unit. But if, obviously, I guess if you're not passing on any genes, then you still want to live your best life anyways. And so mindfulness is going to be that answer, and these skills to keep you as safe and calm and resilient, really, right? Because a lot of bad shit's going to continue to happen from now until the day we die. And that's just what it means to sign up for life. But being equipped and knowing that you have the power to really change your genes is like so fucking cool. Like, I'm like thinking about like what genes have been turned on for me. Okay, what do I need to do now to change that? Because I hope to have children at some point. So yeah. In wrapping up, is there anything else you want to say to listeners before we sign off?
I think the thing that I say so often in our program with families and parents and partners is, this is more complicated on one level than you think. And it's simpler on one level than you think. And that when individuals have these kinds of long-standing struggles, the research tells us, I hate to keep going back to research, but it tells us the idea is the healthier the family can get, the more impact they can have on how that kid or that family member is struggling with what they need to work on. And so often, in family therapy, we call the kid the identified patient. And that it's been my experience in working with highly traumatized and families struggling with addiction is that if we can move that person out of the identified patient role and have the whole family take on the role of a family in recovery or a family that's healing. So it's not just getting the kid to do mindfulness, it's everybody doing mindfulness and beginning to make those changes and to not get down on themselves because no one chose any of this. It's not like there's no volition and like we're not choosing it. And so those would be the two things is that it's complicated, but it's also something that we get down on ourselves about, that we're doing the best we can.
Right. Well, and self-compassion is a practice of mindfulness. So, right, that's where that comes in. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Barnes, for joining me. This conversation was fascinating. I'm going to be following up via email with probably a million other questions. So that's a good thing. That's a good thing. We want listeners to leave being like, ooh, I'm thirsty for more. If you like this episode, go ahead and share it with your loved ones, and we'll catch everyone later.